My name is Renee Castellano, and I'm 27 years old. 3 weeks ago, I sat across from my mother at her kitchen table with a manila folder in my lap and a stack of bank statements inside it that would end the version of our family she had spent 30 years building. She thought she was meeting me for coffee. She had no idea I already knew everything. I want to tell you about the exact moment I understood what had happened to me, because it wasn't loud, and it wasn't a scene. It was quiet, the way the worst truths usually are. I was sitting in a credit union 3 towns over from where I grew up, holding a printed transaction history that a very kind, very nervous branch manager slid across the counter to me because I was, on paper at least, still a named beneficiary on that account. My hands did not shake when I read it. I want you to understand that. I have built a career out of staying calm when other people panic, out of finding the number that doesn't add up in a spreadsheet full of numbers that are supposed to. So when I saw 18 months of withdrawals draining an account that was supposed to be my education fund, an account my grandmother had started before I could even spell my own name, I didn't cry in that lobby. I just sat very still and did the math. The fund had once held just under $41,000. By the time I sat in that credit union, with my coffee going cold in the cup holder of my car outside, it held $412. 18 withdrawals over 18 months. Catering deposits, a florist, a gown boutique in another state, a venue called Cliffside Hollow that, when I looked it up later that night, turned out to be a very exclusive, very expensive wedding property 2 hours from my sister's apartment. My sister Danielle, whom I had not seen walk down any aisle. My sister Danielle, who, as far as I knew, was still just dating her boyfriend Marcus the last time we'd spoken, which had been almost a year ago at that point, because that's how thin the thread between us had gotten. I didn't confront anyone that day. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect these stories to be about someone standing up immediately, fists on the table, voice raised. That is not who I am, and it was never going to be how I handled this. I drove home, I sat in my apartment with the lights off for a long time, and then I did what I have always done when something breaks in my life. I started building a file. 3 weeks later, I called my mother and asked if we could get coffee, just the two of us, at her house, the way we used to when I was in high school, and she'd pour 2 cups, and we'd sit at that same kitchen table, with the chipped corner that nobody ever fixed. She said yes immediately, warmly, the way she always says yes when she thinks a conversation is going to go her way. I could hear it in her voice, that particular brightness she gets when she believes she has already won something before it starts. I brought the folder with me in a canvas tote bag, tucked under a water bottle and a granola bar, like it was nothing, like it wasn't the single heaviest thing I had ever carried into that house. She had the coffee ready when I walked in. Same mugs we'd always used, the ones with the faded sunflowers that had been a gift from someone at her old job 20 years ago. She hugged me at the door the way she always does. One arm, quick, already moving past me toward the kitchen, like the hug was just a formality to get out of the way before the real conversation could start. I sat down across from her. I set the tote bag on the floor beside my chair. I let her talk first, because that's another thing I've learned. Let people talk. Let them build the whole structure of their own story before you show them the part of it that's rotten. She told me about Danielle's new place, about how good Marcus was for her, about how proud she was that both her girls had turned out so well despite everything. Whatever everything was supposed to mean in that sentence. I nodded. I sipped my coffee. And when there was finally a pause, a real one, the kind where she expected me to fill it with something easy, I reached down into the tote bag, and I pulled out the folder, and I set it on the table between us, right next to her mug with the faded sunflowers. I didn't open it right away. I just let it sit there for a second, this plain manila folder with nothing written on the outside, and I watched her eyes drop to it and then come back up to my face, and I watched something behind her expression shift, just slightly, like a person hearing a floorboard creak in a house they thought was empty. I asked her a simple question. I asked her what happened to my college fund. She started to answer the way she always answers hard questions, with a soft laugh and a wave of her hand, and a sentence that began with, "Oh, honey, that's such old news. Why are we digging that up now?" And I let her get about 4 words into it before I opened the folder and turned it around so it was facing her instead of me, and I laid the first page flat on the table with 2 fingers, the way you'd lay down a losing hand you were finally done pretending wasn't yours. It was the transaction history. 18 withdrawals highlighted in yellow. Dates that lined up, almost to the day, with venue deposits, dress fittings, and a florist invoice for a wedding that had happened 5 months ago in a location none of us had ever mentioned to me, at a ceremony I was never invited to, for a marriage I only found out about because a cousin tagged me in a comment under a photo neither my mother nor my sister had ever shown me themselves. My mother went very quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peace. It's the sound of someone doing frantic math in their head and coming up short every single time. I didn't raise my voice. I want you to understand that, because everything that came after this moment depended on the fact that I never once raised my voice in that kitchen. I just looked at her across the chipped corner of that table, past the folder, past the sunflower mugs, past 30 years of being told to wait my turn, to be patient, to be the responsible one while somebody else got the spotlight. And I asked her the only question that actually mattered. I asked her whose wedding she thought she was really paying for that day, mine or hers. That is the question that ended the version of our family my mother had spent her whole life constructing. And to understand exactly how we got to that kitchen table, you have to go back much further than 18 months. You have to go back to the summer I turned 9 years old, the summer I first learned that in my house, love came with a ledger, and I was never the one holding the pen. I grew up in Brookhaven, a town in central Ohio where everybody's front lawn looked like it had been mowed by the same guy on the same Saturday, and where my mother, Carol Castellano, ran our household the way some people run a small business, with quarterly reviews and a very clear sense of who was performing and who wasn't. My father, Gary, worked at a regional insurance office for almost 30 years, steady, quiet, the kind of man who agreed with whatever my mother decided before she'd even finished the sentence. Danielle was 2 years older than me, and from the earliest age I can remember, she was the daughter my mother had built a whole identity around. I don't say that with bitterness anymore, or at least I try not to. I say it because it's simply the truth, and the truth is the only thing that matters in a story like this. The summer I turned 9, my grandmother, my mother's own mother, a sharp, practical woman named Josephine, who worked 31 years as a school secretary and never once retired without a full pension plan mapped out on graph paper, opened a savings account at the credit union in town. She opened 2, actually, one for Danielle and one for me, each seated with $3,000 she'd been quietly setting aside from every birthday and holiday for years. She sat me down on her porch that August and told me, in that plain, unromantic way she said everything, that this money was for college, that it wasn't a gift I could touch now, that it was going to grow slowly in the background of my life, so that one day when I needed it most, it would be there waiting. I remember she made me repeat it back to her. This is your money, Renee, nobody else's. Mine and Danielle's, sitting in 2 separate accounts with our names on them, meant to be the one thing in our house that was actually, unquestionably, ours. My mother was named as the custodian on both accounts, which at the time seemed like nothing more than a formality, the way it always is when a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old can't legally manage their own finances. Statements came in the mail addressed to us, care of Carol Castellano, and my mother would set them on the hallway table under a stack of coupons and grocery flyers, and I honestly don't remember looking at a single one of them before I turned 18. I didn't think to. That's the part that still gets me now, looking back. I trusted the system so completely that I never once thought to check whether it was actually working the way Grandma Josephine had promised. What I noticed instead, because children notice things they can't name yet, was the difference in how Danielle and I moved through that house. Danielle took dance lessons 3 days a week starting at age 6, and then it became competitive dance, and then it became a coach who drove up from Columbus twice a month, and then it became a wardrobe of costumes that lived in a garment bag in the front hall closet like a second family member. I asked once, I must have been 7 or 8, if I could take dance too, and my mother told me gently, in the voice she used when she wanted something to sound like wisdom instead of a decision she'd already made, that not every girl needed the spotlight, that some girls were built to be steady instead, and that steady girls didn't need extra activities pulling focus away from what really mattered. I became the steady girl. I want to be clear that I didn't resent it exactly, not at first, because when you're a kid, and someone tells you that your value comes from being reliable, from not needing things, from being the easy one, you don't hear a warning. You hear a compliment. I got good grades because grades were something I could control entirely on my own, without asking anyone for tutors or lessons or rides across town. I got a part-time job at 14, technically too young by 2 years, but the owner of the local diner knew our family and let me bus tables on weekends for cash under the table, and I remember handing my mother $40 once toward groceries and watching her face light up in a way I never once saw when Danielle brought home a trophy. Danielle got a car for her 16th birthday, a used Civic, but new to her, washed and detailed and parked in the driveway with a bow that my father had actually gone to a party store to buy. I got my sister's old bike with a rusted chain the year I turned 16, and when I mentioned, carefully, gently, the way you learn to mention things in a house like that maybe it was my turn for something, my mother reminded me that Danielle had earned her car through all her hard work at dance, that things weren't always going to be even between sisters, and that I should be proud of Danielle instead of comparing myself to her. I want to tell you about one specific dinner, because it's the moment the fund itself first entered my conscious memory as something I was allowed to think about out loud. I was 12, Danielle was 14. It was my birthday, and my mother had made my favorite meal, and at some point over dessert, my father, in his quiet way, mentioned that he'd gotten a statement in the mail that day, showing my college account had crossed $5,000. I remember feeling something warm and solid settle into my chest, some early proof that Grandma Josephine's promise was real, that somewhere out there my future was quietly being built without me having to fight for it. I asked, in the innocent way a 12-year-old asks things, if I could see the statement sometime, just to watch the number grow. My mother said, of course, sweetheart, next time it comes in, and then she changed the subject to Danielle's upcoming regional competition, and I never saw a single statement from that account. Not that year, not the next, not ever. Not until I sat in a credit union lobby 15 years later and asked a stranger to print one for me, because my own mother never had. There were other small moments like that over the years, little cracks I didn't have the vocabulary yet to identify as warnings. A Christmas where Danielle's gift pile filled an entire corner of the living room and mine fit under one arm, and when I asked, carefully, why the difference, my mother told me that Danielle had a harder year emotionally and needed the extra love right now, as if love had a finite supply that had to be rationed according to who was struggling loudest. A conversation I overheard once, through the thin wall between the kitchen and my bedroom, my mother on the phone with my aunt, saying that Renee doesn't need as much. She's never been a girl who needs a lot of fuss. And I lay there in the dark, turning that sentence over and over, trying to decide if it was a compliment or a sentence being passed down on me before I was even old enough to object to the verdict. By the time I left for college, at 18, with a partial academic scholarship I'd fought for entirely on my own, filling out every application myself at the kitchen table, long after everyone else had gone to bed, my mother told me, almost as an afterthought while helping me pack the car, that the fund wasn't quite ready yet, that there'd been some complications with the account, that we'd sort it out once I actually needed it for tuition, instead of just the scholarship covering things for now. I remember nodding. I remember thinking that made sense, that grown-up financial things were complicated in ways I didn't fully understand yet, and that my mother, who managed our entire household budget down to the dollar, surely had it handled. I drove off to school that fall believing the way you believe things about your own family before you have any reason not to, that somewhere behind me in Brookhaven, Ohio, there was still a number quietly growing with my name on it, waiting for the day I'd finally need it. I had no idea that the account had already started, slowly and quietly, to shrink. I want to tell you about the years I spent building a life that didn't depend on anyone else keeping their promises, because that's really what those years were, even though I didn't have the language for it at the time. I went to Ohio State on that partial academic scholarship, and when the financial aid office ran the numbers that first semester and told me there was still a gap of just over $6,000 for the year, I called my mother from the hallway of my dorm, quietly, so my roommate wouldn't hear, and asked if we could pull from the fund to cover it. She told me the account was tied up with the credit union in some kind of transfer, that Grandma Josephine had set it up years ago under an old account structure that needed updating, that it would take a few months to sort out but not to worry. We'd figure it out before anything came due. I believed her, because why wouldn't I? And I took out my first student loan that semester instead. A modest one, $4,000, and told myself it was temporary, a bridge until the fund caught up. The gap never closed. Every semester, there was a new explanation, always reasonable sounding on its own, always delivered in that warm, unbothered voice my mother used when she wanted a conversation to end quickly. The bank changed its online system, and the paperwork got lost. Grandma Josephine had passed away in my sophomore year, quietly in her sleep, and my mother said the account had to go through some kind of review because of the original custodial terms Josephine had set up before she died. Then it was tax season, and then it was a family emergency involving my father's car, and then it was simply, "We'll talk about it when you're home for break," which never actually happened, because whenever I brought it up in person, my mother would find a reason to be busy, folding laundry, starting dinner, telling me not now, we're supposed to be enjoying your visit. I took out a loan every single semester after that. By the time I graduated, I owed just under $32,000, plus the interest that had already started quietly compounding while I was still in school. I worked the entire time I was in college, the way I'd worked since I was 14. I waited tables 3 nights a week at a chain restaurant off campus. I tutored freshman statistics students for cash. I took a summer internship at a small accounting firm that turned into a part-time job during the school year because the partners liked how careful I was with detail. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters for understanding who I became. I didn't resent the work itself. I actually loved it. Loved the feeling of watching a number I controlled entirely on my own slowly grow in a savings account that had nobody's name on it but mine. No custodian, no complications, no conversations that ended with, "We'll talk about it later." There is a particular kind of peace that comes from building something with your own hands that nobody can quietly drain behind your back, and I didn't know yet that I was building that peace, specifically because somewhere, without my knowledge, my own peace was already being spent on someone else's future. I graduated with a degree in finance, which felt almost like a joke later, given everything, and I landed a junior analyst position at a regional financial planning firm in Columbus, the kind of steady, unglamorous job that pays real money if you're good at it and patient. I was good at it. I moved my numbers around all day for other people, spotted the accounts that didn't reconcile, the transfers that didn't match their stated purpose, the small inconsistencies that told a bigger story if you knew how to read them. It is genuinely strange to me now, looking back, that I spent 8 hours a day professionally noticing exactly the kind of thing that was happening in my own family, and never once thought to point that same attention toward my own mother, because some part of me, even then, still refused to consider her capable of it. The distance between my family and me grew slowly during those years, the way distance usually does, not through some dramatic fight, but through 1,000 small choices to stop reaching out quite as often. Danielle and I had never been especially close, 2 years apart, but somehow always living in entirely different houses, even under the same roof. And once we both left for our own lives, Our contact narrowed down to birthday texts and the occasional group chat message about a holiday dinner. My mother called maybe twice a month, always cheerful, always full of updates about people from Brookhaven I barely remembered. And I noticed, though I didn't examine it closely, that she rarely asked me real questions about my own life, about my job, about whether I was doing okay financially, about whether that loan debt was weighing on me the way it absolutely was. I brought up the fund exactly 3 more times over those years, each time more carefully than the last, because I had started, without fully admitting it to myself, to brace for the answer before I even asked the question. Once at Thanksgiving, my second year out of school, when my mother deflected by saying the account had finally closed out and the funds had been rolled into something for me down the road, whatever that meant, and I was too tired from the drive and too eager to keep the peace to push further. Once over the phone, during a particularly hard month, when my loan payment and rent both came due within days of each other, she told me gently that she didn't have the exact numbers in front of her, but that everything was being handled responsibly, and that I shouldn't worry about it. Worrying wasn't good for me. And once, the last time, about 2 years before everything finally broke open, when I asked directly, plainly, if I could just see a current statement, 1 page, that's all I wanted, and she laughed, a short, surprised sound, and said, "Renee, why on earth are you still thinking about that old account? You're doing so well on your own now, you don't even need it." I let that sentence sit with me for a long time afterwards. You're doing so well on your own now, you don't even need it. I remember driving home that night turning the words over and over the way you turn over a stone, looking for what's crawling underneath it, because there was something in the phrasing that didn't sit right. Some quiet implication that my independence had somehow made the money less mine, less owed, as if the entire purpose of an education fund wasn't to prevent exactly the debt I was still carrying every single month, as if my success, despite the missing money, was proof I'd never really needed it in the first place, rather than proof of how hard I'd had to work because it wasn't there. I stopped asking after that, not because I'd made peace with it, but because every time I asked, I came away feeling smaller somehow, like the question itself was the impolite thing, like I was the one being unreasonable for wanting to know where money with my own name on it had gone. I focused instead on the parts of my life I could control completely. I paid down my loans aggressively, throwing every spare dollar at the principal, refinancing twice to get better rates, tracking every payment in a spreadsheet I updated religiously every month. I got promoted twice and moved into a role advising small business owners on exactly the kind of financial planning my own family had apparently never managed to give me. I built a life that looked, from the outside, completely fine, completely stable, completely independent, and I told myself that was enough, that whatever had happened to that account, I no longer needed it, that I had proven Grandma Josephine's promise unnecessary through sheer force of my own effort. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, sitting in my quiet apartment in Columbus with my loan balance finally dropping below $10,000 for the first time in years, was that while I was congratulating myself for surviving without that money, the very last of it was being spent 2 hours away on a florist deposit for a wedding I hadn't even been told was happening yet. The way I found out my sister was married is a small, ugly detail I still think about more than almost anything else in this whole story, because it tells you everything you need to know about where I actually stood in that family by the time I was 27. I found out from a comment on Instagram, left by our cousin Marissa under a photo my sister hadn't even posted herself. It was a repost from an account called Cliffside Hollow Events, a professional photographer's page, showing a wide, golden shot of a stone terrace strung with lights, a bride in a fitted lace gown standing beside a man I recognized after a second as Marcus, Danielle's boyfriend of almost 2 years, both of them laughing at something just out of frame. Marissa's comment read, "So beautiful getting to be there for this. Can't believe it's already been 5 months," and underneath it, 3 heart emojis from people whose names I recognized as my mother's coworkers. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time before I did anything at all. I want to be honest about the order of feelings, because I think it matters. The first thing I felt wasn't anger. It was a strange, hollow kind of confusion, the sensation of reading a sentence in a language you're supposed to understand, and realizing halfway through that none of the words mean what you thought they meant. 5 months. My sister had been married for 5 months, and in that time we had exchanged exactly 2 text messages, one about a group chat mix-up regarding a cousin's baby shower gift, and one where she'd sent me a meme about Mondays. Nothing about a wedding, nothing about an engagement I hadn't even known existed, because I realized, scrolling back through my own messages with her, that I had never once heard the word engaged in reference to Marcus at all. Whatever had happened between them, it had happened entirely outside the frame of my life, quietly, deliberately, while I was 2 hours away thinking we were simply distant the way sisters sometimes become distant, not distant because I had been specifically, carefully excluded. I clicked into the photographer's account and scrolled through the full gallery, and that's when the second feeling arrived, the one that actually mattered, the one that started the whole slow unraveling that led me eventually to a credit union counter and then to my mother's kitchen table. Because the wedding in those photos was not a small, modest thing. It was not a courthouse ceremony or a backyard gathering with a rented tent. Cliffside Hollow, when I looked it up that same night, sitting cross-legged on my couch with my laptop balanced on my knees, turned out to be an exclusive event venue 2 hours outside Columbus, the kind of place with a pricing page that required you to submit an inquiry form just to see a number, the kind of place that hosted maybe 30 weddings a year because of how much land and staff and preparation each one required. I found a review from another couple online mentioning their own venue deposit alone had been $11,000, not including catering, florals, photography, or the dress. I looked at the dress next, because something about it had been nagging at me in the photos, a familiarity I couldn't place at first. It took me almost 20 minutes of searching before I found it, a boutique in Chicago that specialized in custom lace gowns, and there, buried in an old post on the boutique's own page from earlier that year, was a fitting photo of my sister in the exact dress from the wedding. The caption reading, "So honored to help this beautiful bride find her dream gown. Congratulations, Danielle. My sister does not make Chicago boutique money." I knew this with absolute certainty. I am a financial planner, because I had, at one point, actually helped her build a modest budget spreadsheet 2 years earlier when she was complaining about credit card debt from her job as a dental hygienist's assistant, a job that paid, at the very generous high end, somewhere around $42,000 a year, in a city with a cost of living that ate most of it before it ever reached savings. I want to tell you about the moment the pieces actually started assembling themselves into a shape, because it didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, over the course of that night and the next few days, the way a suspicion has to build a case against your own family before you're willing to let yourself fully believe it. I called Danielle first, 2 days after I found the photos, and I kept my voice light, casual, the way you talk when you're testing water you already suspect is too hot. I told her I'd seen the pictures online, that I was happy for her, and I asked, as gently as I could manage, why nobody had told me, why I hadn't been invited, why I was finding out from a stranger's comment months after the fact. There was a long pause on the line before she answered, and when she did, her voice had a strange, careful quality to it, like she was reading from a script someone else had handed her. She said it had been complicated, that Marcus's family situation was sensitive, that his parents hadn't fully approved of the relationship at first, and they'd needed to keep things quiet while everything sorted itself out, and that our mother had helped them plan it discreetly because of all that. And she was sorry. She really was. It just hadn't felt like the right time to bring me in. I asked her, as evenly as I could, who had paid for it, because the numbers I'd found online didn't remotely line up with anything Danielle or Marcus could reasonably afford on their own. There was an even longer pause this time. She said, finally, that Mom had helped, that Mom had wanted to give them something special after everything Danielle had been through emotionally that year, and that it wasn't really her place to get into the specifics, that I should really just be happy for her and let it go. I did not let it go. I sat with that phrase for the rest of that week, everything Danielle had been through emotionally that year, and I recognized it instantly because it was the same sentence, almost word for word, that my mother had used when I was 12 years old and asked why my sister's Christmas gifts filled a whole corner of the living room while mine fit under one arm. Danielle needed the extra love right now. Danielle had a harder year. There was always, apparently, a harder year, an emotional need, some invisible justification that made the math come out uneven, and I had spent 27 years accepting that math without ever once being shown the actual ledger. So I called my mother directly, and I asked her, plainly, how much the wedding had cost and where the money had come from, because I wanted to hear her say it herself, in her own words, before I let myself believe what I was already starting to suspect. She laughed that same short, surprised laugh she'd used 2 years earlier when I'd asked to see a fund statement, and she told me I was being dramatic, that families help each other, that this was exactly the kind of thing that happens when you don't have your own children yet, and don't understand what parents do for the people they love, and that if I really needed to know so badly, we could talk about it properly sometime, not over the phone like this. I hung up that call and sat very still in my apartment for a long time, and I felt something settle into place inside me that I can only describe as the exact opposite of confusion. It was clarity, cold, complete clarity, because I had spent my entire professional life learning to recognize the specific shape of an evasive answer, the particular rhythm of someone deflecting instead of denying, and my mother had not once, in either of those conversations, actually told me the wedding hadn't come from my fund. She had told me I was being dramatic. She had told me families help each other. She had told me anything and everything except the one simple sentence that would have put this whole ugly feeling to rest, which was no, Renee, that money never touched your education fund, and the fact that she never said it was the loudest answer she could have given me. The next morning, before work, I called the credit union in Brookhaven, the same one Grandma Josephine had walked me into when I was 9 years old, and I asked what I needed to bring in to check the current status of an education account that had been opened in my name, because I was done asking my mother questions she was never going to answer honestly, and I had finally started asking the people who couldn't afford to lie to me. The credit union in Brookhaven had barely changed in 18 years, still the same brick building on Maple and 3rd, with the same faded blue awning, and walking back through those doors as an adult felt strange in a way I hadn't expected, like stepping into a photograph of my own childhood. I had called ahead the day before, spoken with someone in member services who told me that as a named beneficiary on a custodial account, I'd become entitled to full disclosure the moment I turned 18, something nobody had ever bothered explaining to me at the time, and that I simply needed a valid ID and the original account number, which I found, after an hour of digging through old boxes in my closet, on a single surviving statement from when I was 15, yellowed at the corners, still addressed to me care of Carol Castellano. The woman who helped me that morning was named Patrice, mid-50s, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, the kind of quiet, careful competence you only find in people who have spent decades doing the same exacting work. She pulled up the account on her screen, and I watched her face change slightly, just a small tightening around her eyes, the look of someone who has seen a number that doesn't sit right and knows better than to react to it out loud in front of a customer. She turned the monitor toward me, the way you'd turn a photograph toward someone at a funeral, gently, like she already understood this was going to hurt. The account had opened with $3,000 from my grandmother in the summer I turned 9, and by the time I graduated high school it had grown, through her continued contributions, some interest, and a handful of smaller gifts from relatives over the years, to just over $40,000, $40,912 exactly, according to the balance recorded the June before I left for Ohio State. I remember staring at that number for a long moment, because it was the first time in my entire life I had ever actually seen it in writing. The first time the promise Grandma Josephine made me repeat back to her on that porch had turned into something concrete and real, instead of a vague, comforting idea I'd been asked to trust without evidence. Patrice printed the full transaction history for me, 11 pages, and I sat down in one of the small chairs near her desk and went through it line by line while she quietly excused herself to help another customer, giving me the privacy, I think, to fall apart if I needed to. I did not fall apart. I want to be honest about that, because it surprises people when I tell them. I felt, instead, a strange, focused stillness settle over me. The exact feeling I get at my job when I'm 3 hours into reconciling a set of books that refuses to balance. Right before I finally find the error, my hands did not shake. I simply started reading and highlighting, using a yellow pen I borrowed from a cup on Patrice's desk, every withdrawal that didn't belong. The pattern, once I saw it, was almost too clean, too obvious, the kind of thing that would have taken me maybe 10 minutes to flag if I'd been looking at a stranger's finances instead of my own. Small, steady withdrawals through most of my college years, 200 here, 400 there, always described in the memo line as education expense or Renee tuition support, which lined up, roughly, with the years I was actually enrolled, though even those numbers never quite matched what my mother had told me at the time about the account being tied up or inaccessible. But then, beginning almost exactly 18 months before that day in the credit union lobby, the withdrawals changed entirely, larger, faster, and the memo lines, whoever had typed them into whatever online form the credit union used, had stopped even pretending. $11,000, memo line reading venue deposit, Cliffside Hollow. 6 weeks later, 4,200, memo line reading Chicago boutique gown balance. A little over 3,000 for catering, split across 2 withdrawals a month apart, 1,800 for florals. 2,200 for a photographer whose name I now recognized from the very Instagram account that had first shown me the wedding. A final withdrawal, 4 days before what I now knew was the actual wedding date. For the remaining balance available, 3,000 and change, memo line simply reading final expenses. 18 withdrawals in 18 months, every single one of them, once I laid them side by side with the dates I'd found earlier that week researching Cliffside Hollow and the boutique and the photographer, matching almost to the day. I sat in that small chair for what must have been 20 minutes, not moving, just running the same math over and over, checking it the way you check a number you desperately want to be wrong. $40,912, the balance in June before I left for college. $412, the balance on the screen in front of me that morning. $40,500, gone. Almost the exact price range Cliffside Hollow's own website had quoted for a full wedding package including venue, catering for roughly 100 guests, florals and photography, plus a gown that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Patrice came back at some point and asked, quietly, if I needed anything else, and I asked her a question I already suspected I knew the answer to, because I needed to hear it confirmed by someone who had no reason to protect my mother. I asked her whether an account like this, custodial, with the beneficiary's own name on it, required the beneficiary's knowledge or consent for withdrawals of this size. She hesitated for a moment, the careful hesitation of someone who has to choose her words within the boundaries of what she's allowed to say, and then she told me that legally, once the account had been established as a custodial account under the state's version of the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, the custodian had a fiduciary duty to use the funds for the benefit of the named minor, and that using those funds for an unrelated third party, even a family member, without the beneficiary's knowledge, could potentially constitute a breach of that duty, possibly even conversion, depending on how a court chose to look at it. She said this carefully, professionally, the way you'd explain something you're not supposed to be explaining, and then she added, almost as an afterthought, that she couldn't offer legal advice, but that if I wanted, I was entitled to a certified copy of the full history, and that I might want to speak with an attorney before doing anything else. I asked for the certified copy. I watched her print it, stamp it, sign it, seal it into an envelope, and I remember the particular weight of that envelope in my hands as I walked back out through the same glass doors I'd walked through as a 9-year-old holding my grandmother's hand, believing with my whole small heart that this building held something in it that was mine, and only mine, something nobody could ever quietly take away. I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long time before I turned the key. I did not call my mother. I did not call Danielle. I opened my phone instead and searched for family law attorneys in Columbus who handled custodial account disputes, and I found one, a woman named Catherine Voss, whose website mentioned specifically that she'd handled multiple cases involving UTMA account misuse by parents against adult children, and I called her office that same afternoon and made an appointment for the following week. Then, and only then, sitting in that parking lot with a certified envelope of my own stolen future resting on the passenger seat beside me, did I finally let myself feel the full weight of what had happened, not as confusion anymore, not as suspicion, but as fact, cold and documented and undeniable, and I understood that whatever came next, I was no longer the daughter who waited patiently for an explanation that never arrived. I was the daughter who had finally learned how to read the ledger for herself. Catherine Voss's office was on the 3rd floor of a converted brick building near downtown Columbus, and I remember sitting in her waiting room a full 10 minutes early, the certified envelope from the credit union resting in my lap, like something fragile, running through the story in my head one more time as if rehearsing it might make it hurt less to say out loud to a stranger. When she finally called me back, she was younger than I expected, maybe 40, direct in a way I found immediately reassuring, the kind of person who takes notes while you talk, instead of just nodding sympathetically and letting you run out of things to say. I laid the whole thing out for her, the fund, the years of deflection, the wedding photos, the 18 withdrawals, and she listened without interrupting once, occasionally sliding the certified transaction history closer to herself to check a date against something I'd said. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, tapping her pen against the edge of her legal pad, and then she told me something that reframed the entire situation in a way I hadn't fully considered until she said it plainly. The account, she explained, had been established under Ohio's version of the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, which meant that from the moment my grandmother funded it, the money legally belonged to me, not to my mother, not to the family in some general shared sense, but to me specifically, held in trust by my mother as custodian until I turned 18, or the account terminated according to its terms. A custodian under that law has what's called a fiduciary duty, Catherine said, which means every single dollar taken from that account has to be used for the benefit of the minor it belongs to. Education, healthcare, direct support, nothing else. Diverting those funds to pay for another person's wedding, even a sibling's, even with good intentions dressed up as love, wasn't simply an unfair family decision. It was, depending on how a court chose to characterize it, a straightforward breach of fiduciary duty, and in the more serious framing, potentially civil conversion, which is the legal term for using someone else's property as if it were your own. I asked her what that actually meant for me, practically, because I hadn't walked into her office looking for a courtroom. Not really. I think some part of me had just wanted a professional to confirm that what I was feeling wasn't dramatic or unreasonable, the way my mother had accused me of being on the phone. Catherine told me I had real options, and she laid them out carefully, the way you'd lay out a set of tools on a table so someone could choose which one actually fit the job. I could send a formal demand letter, drafted by her office, requesting a full accounting and repayment of the misappropriated funds, which sometimes resolved these situations without ever going further, especially once families realized there was real documentation behind the accusation instead of just hurt feelings. I could file a civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty and conversion if a demand letter didn't work, which would be public record and would likely take months, possibly longer if my mother chose to fight it. Or, she said, watching my face carefully as she said it, I could decide the money itself mattered less to me at this point than the truth being acknowledged, in which case a demand letter alone, sent with the weight of an attorney behind it, might be enough to force exactly that kind of reckoning inside the family, whether or not a single dollar was ever actually repaid. I told her I needed to think about it, and she said that was smart, that she never wanted a client deciding this in the same week they'd just found out the full scope of what happened, that grief and anger make excellent fuel but terrible navigators. She had her paralegal draft the demand letter anyway, at my request, so it would be ready the moment I decided how I wanted to use it, and I left her office that afternoon with a folder of my own now, a real one, the certified transaction history from the credit union, a printed summary of Ohio's UTMA statute Catherine had highlighted for me in 3 places, and a draft letter I hadn't yet decided whether I'd ever send. It was 2 days later that my grandmother's older sister, my great-aunt Delphine, called me completely out of nowhere, and I want to tell you about that call because it changed the shape of everything that came after it. Delphine was 81, lived alone in a small house 40 minutes outside Brookhaven, and I hadn't spoken to her directly in probably 3 years, beyond a holiday card. She told me, in her slow, deliberate way, that she'd heard through a cousin that I'd been asking questions about Josephine's old accounts, and that she thought it was finally time I knew something Josephine had told her privately, years before she passed, something Josephine had made her promise to hold on to in case exactly this kind of situation ever arose. Delphine told me that my grandmother had never fully trusted my mother with money, not because she thought Carol was a bad person, but because she'd watched her own daughter, over the years, quietly favor Danielle in ways that troubled her, and Josephine had been sharp enough, practical enough, to worry that an account with no oversight might eventually become an account with no boundaries. So when she set up my fund and Danielle's fund at the credit union, she had also, privately, kept her own paper copies of every single statement mailed to the house, going all the way back to when the accounts opened, filed away in a fireproof box in her hall closet that Delphine had inherited when Josephine passed and had simply never known what to do with, until now. Delphine mailed me that box 2 days later, and when it arrived I sat on my kitchen floor and went through it piece by piece, and there, near the bottom, was something I hadn't expected at all, a single handwritten letter in my grandmother's careful, upright cursive, dated the same summer she'd sat me down on her porch and made me repeat back her promise. It was addressed simply to whoever needs this someday, and in it, she wrote plainly that she was starting 2 separate education accounts, one for Danielle and one for Renee, funded and intended entirely for their own individual educations and nothing else, that she was naming Carol as custodian only because the law required an adult, and that if anything ever happened where those funds were used for any purpose other than the specific child they belonged to, she wanted whichever girl it happened to know, without doubt, that the money had never been a family fund to begin with. It had always, only, specifically, been theirs. I sat on that kitchen floor for a long time, holding a letter my grandmother had written before I was even 10 years old, a letter that had been quietly waiting 15 years for exactly this moment, and I understood then that I had never actually needed to build my case entirely alone. My grandmother, in her plain, practical, unromantic way, had built half of it for me already, and had simply been waiting, patiently, from beyond her own quiet grave, for the day someone would finally need it. I called Catherine Voss the next morning and told her I was ready to move forward, and I asked her to add one more document to the folder before we sent anything at all. I decided against sending the demand letter cold through the mail, and I want to explain why, because it matters for understanding everything that happened next. Catherine had told me the letter would likely get the strongest reaction, and probably the fastest resolution, if my mother received it in a setting where she couldn't simply set it aside on the hallway table under a stack of coupons the way she'd once set aside every single statement that ever arrived with my name on it. I wanted her to open that folder in front of me, at her own kitchen table, the same table where I'd spent 27 years being told to wait, to be patient, to be the steady one who didn't need extra fuss. So I called her, and I asked if we could get coffee, just the two of us, and I brought the folder in a canvas tote bag, with a water bottle and a granola bar on top of it, the way I described at the very start of this story, and I sat across from her, at that chipped table, and let her talk about Danielle and Marcus, and how proud she was of her girls, until there was finally a pause I could fill, with something other than her version of events. I laid the certified transaction history down first, the 18 highlighted withdrawals lined up in order, and I watched her face do the thing I'd been bracing myself to see for weeks. That particular kind of stillness that isn't calm at all. It's the sound of someone doing frantic math in their head and coming up short every single time. She started with the same deflection she always used. "Oh, honey, that's such old news. Why are we digging that up now?" And I let her get exactly 4 words into it before I turned the page around and laid it flat with 2 fingers. Then I set the second document beside it, the printed summary of Ohio's UTMA statute, with Catherine's highlights marking the exact language about fiduciary duty and permitted use of funds, and I told her plainly, in the calmest voice I could manage, that this wasn't really old news at all. It was current news, because the account had never legally belonged to her to spend in the first place. She tried a different approach after that, the one I'd been expecting all along, the one built entirely around guilt instead of denial. She told me I didn't understand what it was like to watch one daughter struggle emotionally, while the other one always seemed fine, always seemed capable, always seemed like she didn't need the same kind of help. She told me Danielle had gone through a hard time with Marcus's family, that his parents hadn't approved of her at first, because of things that weren't fair to explain right now, and that giving Danielle a beautiful wedding had felt, in the moment, like the only thing she could offer to make her daughter feel chosen and worthy after months of feeling like she wasn't good enough for the family she was marrying into. She said she'd always meant to pay it back somehow, quietly, before I ever needed to know, and that she was sorry it had gotten this complicated, but that surely I could see it had come from love, not from any intention to hurt me. I let her finish because I had learned, from watching 1,000 small conversations in that house over the years, that interrupting someone mid-excuse only gives them room to build a longer one. And then I reached into the tote bag one final time and pulled out my grandmother's letter, the one Delphine had mailed me, still creased from 15 years, folded inside a fireproof box, and I set it gently on top of everything else, because I wanted it to be the last thing she read, not the first. I watched my mother's hands actually shake reading that letter, the first time I'd seen her hands shake through this entire conversation, and I understood why. It wasn't the credit union statements that broke her composure, because statements can be explained away, reframed, softened with the right story about love and hard years and quiet intentions. It was her own mother's handwriting, plain and upright and specific, stating in her own words exactly what that money had always been for, and exactly what it had never, under any circumstance, been intended to become. Whoever needs this someday. My mother read that letter twice, and when she looked up at me, something in her face had genuinely collapsed. Not performed collapse, not the practiced softness she used to end hard conversations quickly, but something real underneath it that I hadn't expected to see and didn't entirely know what to do with. That's when I heard the front door open behind us, and Danielle walked in. I hadn't planned that part. I want to be honest about that, because I think people assume these confrontations are always carefully staged, every element accounted for in advance, and this one wasn't. My mother had apparently mentioned to Danielle earlier that week that I was coming by, not knowing what I was actually bringing, and Danielle had decided on her own to stop in on her way home from work, thinking she was walking into a normal Sunday visit. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, reading the room, the folders spread open across the table, our mothers shaking hands, my own carefully still expression, and I watched something shift across her face too, a slow dawning confusion that I chose, in that moment, to give the benefit of the doubt. I asked her directly, in front of our mother, whether she had known where the wedding money actually came from. There was a long silence before she answered, and when she finally spoke, Her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. She said she'd asked, once, early on, when the numbers being discussed for the venue, and the dress had started feeling too large for anything either she or Marcus could realistically afford. Our mother had told her not to worry about the details, that it was being handled, that this was simply what mothers do for their daughters on the most important day of their lives. She said she hadn't wanted to push harder, because pushing harder might have meant not having the wedding at all, and she admitted, quietly, staring at the highlighted transaction history on the table, that some small part of her had probably suspected something wasn't quite right, and had chosen not to look too closely at it, because looking closely felt like it might ruin something she desperately wanted to believe she'd earned honestly. My father came in a few minutes later, home from running errands, and found the three of us sitting in near total silence around that kitchen table, a folder of documents spread out like evidence at a trial nobody had officially called. He didn't ask what was happening right away. He simply looked at the papers, and then at my mother's face, and something in his own expression told me he already understood more than he was letting on. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost defeated, and he admitted, to all of us, that he'd known the fund had been touched, that he'd seen a few of the earlier statements over the years, and asked Carol about it, and that she'd told him it was temporary, a loan against the account that would be repaid before either girl ever needed it, and he'd chosen, the way he'd chosen almost everything in that house for 30 years, to simply trust her and stay quiet, rather than ask the harder questions himself. I sat there across from all three of them, my mother, my sister, my father, in the kitchen where I had spent my entire childhood learning to be the steady one, the easy one, the one who didn't need extra fuss, and I felt something inside me finally settle into place that had been unsteady my whole life. I told them, calmly, that I wasn't there to destroy the family, but that I was there to make sure the truth existed on the record, somewhere outside of my own memory. Because for 27 years, the truth in that house had only ever been whatever version my mother decided to tell, and I was done accepting that as the final word on my own life. What happened in the weeks after that Sunday at the kitchen table unfolded slowly, the way real consequences usually do, without the neat, dramatic timing you see in movies. Catherine sent the formal demand letter 3 days later, not because I still needed to convince my mother of anything, she already knew everything by then, but because I needed the acknowledgement to exist somewhere official, in writing, with a lawyer's letterhead attached to it, so that whatever came next would be built on something more solid than a conversation that could quietly get reframed over time, the way everything in that house always eventually got reframed. The letter laid out the full accounting, the original balance, the 18 withdrawals, the total misappropriated, just over $40,000, and it requested a structured repayment plan, rather than an immediate lump sum, because I wasn't trying to bankrupt my own parents, I was trying to make the debt real to them, in a way it had never been real before. My mother agreed to the terms within 2 weeks, through Catherine's office instead of directly to me, which I understood, because I think some part of her genuinely couldn't face me again yet, without the buffer of formal paperwork between us. She and my father refinanced part of their house to cover a significant portion of it up front, and set up a monthly payment plan for the rest, spread across 4 years, deposited directly into an account Catherine helped me open, that had nothing to do with any custodial structure this time, an account with only my name on it, and no one else's authority attached to it at all. I want to be honest that the money itself, by the time it started actually arriving, mattered less to me than I expected it to. My loans were already down to under $10,000 by then, paid off almost entirely through 8 years of waiting tables and tutoring and careful budgeting, and there was something strange and almost anticlimactic about watching money finally arrive for a debt I had already, in every practical sense, paid myself twice over. Danielle and I did not speak for almost 3 months after that day in the kitchen. I don't think either of us fully knew how to. She reached out first, eventually, with a long text message that turned into a phone call, and she told me she'd spent those months sitting with the discomfort of realizing how much she'd chosen not to look at, how easy it had been to accept a version of events that let her keep something she wanted without asking the harder questions, and she apologized in a way that felt, for the first time in our adult lives, genuinely earned instead of performed. I don't think our relationship has fully healed even now, and I'm not sure it ever will in the way it might have if none of this had happened, but we talk regularly, and last month she offered, on her own, without my asking, to start paying me back a portion of what the wedding had actually cost, separate from whatever our mother repays, because she said she couldn't keep living in a house that beautiful, knowing exactly what floor it had been built on. My father's response surprised me the most, honestly. He started calling me every couple of weeks, real calls, not the brief check-ins he used to leave to my mother, and slowly, carefully, he began telling me things about the years I'd missed, small moments where he'd wanted to say something and hadn't, statements he'd glimpsed on the hallway table that he now wished he'd actually opened instead of trusting were being handled. He never made excuses for himself the way my mother initially had, and I think that's part of why I've been able to let him back in more than I have with her. He told me once, on one of those calls, that he thought the two of us, Danielle and I, had spent our whole childhood being weighed against each other on a scale neither of us ever agreed to stand on, and that he regretted, more than almost anything else in his life, never once stepping in to take either of us off it. My mother and I are still rebuilding something, slowly, carefully, and I want to be honest that it doesn't look anything like reconciliation the way people usually imagine it. We don't talk every week. I don't think I'll ever fully trust her with anything that matters financially again, and I've told her that plainly, without cruelty, just as a fact she needs to understand the way I now understand facts about her. But she did, eventually, apologize in a way that didn't have an excuse folded into it, sitting across from me at that same chipped table on a different Sunday, months later, and she told me she'd spent her whole life believing that being a good mother meant being needed, meant fixing whichever daughter's crisis was loudest in the moment, and that somewhere along the way she'd convinced herself that my steadiness meant I didn't require the same attention. When really, she said, it had probably just meant I'd learned early that asking for help in that house rarely got me anywhere honest. I used part of the repaid money, once it started arriving, to do something I'd been thinking about since the very first week I sat in that credit union lobby, reading 11 pages of transaction history. I set up a small scholarship fund of my own, seeded initially with $5,000, at the same credit union in Brookhaven, open to any local student who needs help closing the gap between financial aid and actual tuition. The exact gap I spent 4 years quietly filling myself with loans, while I believed, wrongly, that help was already on its way. I named it after my grandmother, the Josephine Castellano Education Fund, and I sat with Patrice, the same woman who had first pulled up my account and turned the monitor toward me so gently, while we filled out the paperwork to make it official. She remembered me. She told me she was glad to see the ending of this particular story turn into the beginning of someone else's. I think about that porch a lot now, the summer I turned 9, my grandmother's plain, practical voice asking me to repeat her promise back to her, "This is your money, Renee, nobody else's." I understand now that she wasn't just talking about the account itself. She was talking about something bigger than money, something about what it means to have a life that belongs entirely to you, that no one else gets to quietly spend down while telling you it's for your own good. It took me 27 years, a manila folder, and a fireproof box mailed by a great aunt I barely knew, to finally understand what she meant. But I understand it now completely, and I don't think I'll ever forget it again. If you're watching this and you've ever been the steady one in your own family, the one who was told you didn't need as much fuss, I want you to know that being easy to overlook was never actually a compliment, and it's never too late to ask to see the statement for yourself. Tell me in the comments if you've ever discovered something about your own family that changed everything you thought you knew, and if this story meant something to you, make sure you're subscribed, because there are more stories like this one still to come.